Well, hello everyone on this bright, sunny Saturday morning. We're happy to be with you. I'm Kathy Henshaw, and with me is my sister Tracy Trader. Well, she's not exactly right with me. We are social distancing, right, Trace?
Yeah, I'm at my house, you're at yours.
Yeah. So we're the owners of Intentional Connections, and we'd like to welcome you to this presentation on cultivating authenticity. We'd like to take a moment first, though, before we begin, to let you know that the chat feature is open, so feel free to use it during the presentation to make any comments. If you have any questions, however, please save them until the end. We're going to stay online for a while after we finish to answer any questions you might have at that time. We're grateful that you joined us today. Tracy and I have been looking forward to sharing with you our thoughts on cultivating authenticity. We'd like you to imagine how different your life could be if you really loved the unique person that you are and could move out in the world being your authentic self and making intentional and genuine, heart-centered connections with others. In order to get to that place of authenticity, we need to first explore the concepts of authenticity, vulnerability, and shame. Wow, doesn't that sound exciting? I mean, yikes, who doesn't want to talk about vulnerability and shame, right?
Yeah, me.
No, no, no. It's not something we usually talk about with each other, is it? A lot of what we're going to share with you comes from the work of Brené Brown. Brené is a research professor at the University of Houston, a lecturer and author who's focused most of her work in this area. We highly recommend her books, and we'll highlight a couple of them later on. Research has proven that there's a direct link between having quality social connections, quality relationships in our lives, a sense of belonging, and our overall health and wellness. We'll start by going over some of the research in this area. So this is a quote from Brené Brown that we particularly love. I define connection as the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from the relationship. We're hardwired to connect with others. It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. And without it, there's suffering. We're hardwired for belonging. It's in our DNA. Fitting in is assessing and acclimating. Here's what I should say. Here's what I shouldn't say. Here's what I should be. Here's what I should avoid talking about. Here's what I should dress like or look like. That's fitting in. In other words, hustling for acceptance and changing who we are to fit in. Belonging is belonging to yourself first. Speaking your truth, telling your story, and never retraining yourself for other people. True belonging doesn't require you to change who you are. It requires you to be who you are, and that's vulnerable. Being the best version of you is the goal.
So in today's society, many of us are craving meaningful, genuine connection with others. When this connection is lacking is when we feel disconnected, and that is when we experience loneliness. The feeling of loneliness is when someone lacks meaningful connections. It's a prompt to push us to connect with other people. Right now, with the pandemic, even introverts are feeling very isolated and lonely. But even before the pandemic, this era was being referred to as the age of crisis of connection. Currently, we are physically distancing ourselves from others on purpose. But feeling lonely isn't just about being physically isolated. How many of you have been in a room full of people and felt lonely? I know that I have. Even if you're not actually physically isolated and you are gathering and conversing with others, we can still feel lonely. I've been at parties, lots of other people around, and felt lonely. These days, a lot of teenagers in particular are together and yet on their phones, demonstrating what it's like to be alone and yet together. A recent study found that the number of close friends people report as having has reduced from 3 down to 2. And perhaps the most concerning of all is that 1 in 10 people say they have no close friendships at all. So while we might have hundreds of Facebook, Instagram, or Snapchat friends and followers, on average, our true close friends are decreasing. And as the screen states, approximately 20% of Americans report feeling lonely in 1980, and now today it's more than double that percentage. Another thing plaguing a fair chunk of America is exhaustion. A lot of companies get feedback from their employees that they're exhausted from all of the busyness. But what the research is finding is that a lot of people are actually feeling exhausted because they feel lonely. We propose that there are a few other issues that also play into this feeling of exhaustion in addition to loneliness. But that's just a whole nother presentation. So here's the thing. Loneliness not only doesn't feel good, but it impacts our health. Here are some statistics for you to consider. Your odds of dying early if you live with air pollution is 5%. Your risk of dying early if you live with obesity is 20%. Your odds of dying early if you excessively drink are 30%. And your odds of dying early if you live with long-term loneliness is a whopping 45%. Your social connection score is as predictive of how long you'll live as obesity, high blood pressure, or smoking. Social support is the greatest predictor of long-term happiness that we have. There's so much loneliness on our planet, and yet we are so technologically connected. How many people do you meet that are so present that just by them listening, deeply listening, or just by them being, you feel safer around them? So let's talk for a moment about empathy. Because research is also showing that we are 40% less empathetic than we were 30 years ago. Yikes, guys, that's a significant change, a significant drop. And empathy is the oil that keeps relationships running smoothly. So a large decrease in empathy does not make for healthy relationships. So here's the kicker. Empathy is a skill that is learned through interacting with people face to face. What we're learning is that one of the main reasons that empathy is on the decline is due to this increased usage of technology, and in particular, the use of smartphones. The average adult spends 11 hours per day using screens. These devices, which are touted to create connection, are actually the source of social disconnection and loneliness. Now, I am by no means anti-technology. I love the advantages that technology brings us. Man, we wouldn't be able to do this workshop today if it wasn't for technology. But it's important to understand the impact that it's having on our lives and on our connections with others so that we can make smart choices. As I mentioned, we learn empathy best through vulnerable situations and experiences. On social media, we are masking our vulnerability. Social media portrays one side of our life, and it's the side that we want people to see, not our vulnerable side. We can't empathize with each other when we aren't being vulnerable. We are in a culture that is surrounded by technology and social media that help to create and promote a false image of perfection. We have this pursuit of perfection that many of us are striving for. We are creating these fake lives, and a lot of us are trying to live up to each other's perceived, perfect, fake lives. As a result, we are experiencing disconnection in our lives and our relationships, and this leads to loneliness. As we've mentioned in our previous presentation, comparison is the thief of joy, and striving for perfection also robs us of our joy, our happiness, and ultimately our wellness. There's actually an interesting piece of research that just came out where scientists put a dummy phone on a table, not even a real phone. And the very physical presence of a phone that wasn't even real reduced people's cognitive ability. In other words, the very presence of a fake phone makes us dumber. If you and I were having a meal together and we put a phone on the table, the level of our connection is absolutely going to go down. We learn and practice empathy through face-to-face contact. We are hardwired to use what's called mirror neurons and read facial expressions and body language in order to empathize with others. With the absence of the face-to-face contact, we're losing our ability to empathize. If we exercise empathy, then we foster connection. If we don't, we become disconnected and ultimately foster loneliness. The more lonely we are, the more our brain goes into self-preservation mode. When it does this, our brain is also less capable of exercising empathy and compassion because it goes into defensive mode. Loneliness increases our defensiveness and it creates a downward spiral. Well, right now, we're all forced to use technology exclusively. Other than with the individuals that are in our households, and it certainly has its benefits. But beyond our current situation, let's keep in mind that face-to-face interaction is where it's at. It's where we cultivate authentic connections.
We all long to be loved, to be accepted, to belong, to be connected. It's a basic human need. And as much as we may sometimes proclaim that we don't need anyone, the truth is we're hardwired for social connection.
Yes, and you know, it's not just anybody, it's all of us. We are all hardwired for social connection, right, Kathy? It's all of us. So don't forget that. It's even the person that comes across as maybe being perfect and having lots of friends. We all need this in our lives.
Right, Trace. And it's even those of us who are melancholies and prefer alone time, we still need social connection.
Yeah.
So here's what most of us do before we walk out into the world. We armor up. We put on our coats, our hats, and our masks, and we armor ourselves up. An example of what this might look like is changing who you are to fit in with all kinds of groups, pretending to like sports when you're amongst one group, pretending to be book smart when you're with another group, pretending to be popular with yet another, hustling about like a chameleon just to be accepted by everyone.
Wow, Kath, I know that I see that in myself. That really resonates with me. And certainly in my younger years, before I knew about armoring up, I would hustle to fit in with whatever crowd that I was with at that moment in time.
Yeah. And it can also take the form of needing to always look a certain way when you go out in public, or to only show a certain side of yourself that you think will be acceptable, right? In other words, picking and choosing what you present of yourself to others and shielding the rest. According to research by Deloitte on covering or masking at work, 61% of respondents reported covering at least one aspect of themselves while at the office. So there is you, and then there is the you that you present to the world, right? From a management perspective, this is problematic because when a person feels compelled to hide aspects of themselves, it causes stress and burnout, as well as disengagement. When they're encouraged to be authentic, however, it boosts positivity and morale and increases job satisfaction. So here's how we assemble our armor. I'm not enough. Well, if I'm honest with them about what's happening, they'll think less of me, or maybe even use it against me. No way am I going to be honest about this. No one else does. Why do I have to put myself out there? Yeah, screw them. I don't see them being honest about what scares them, and they've got plenty of issues. It's actually their issues and shortcomings that make me act this way. This is their fault, and they're trying to blame me. In fact, now that I think about it, I'm actually better than them. Does some of this self-talk sound familiar?
It sure does. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to just pause and think for a moment what your response would be to this statement. I grew up believing that vulnerability is. Feel free to add a response to the chat page if you would like. Here are some of the common responses that we've received from other workshop participants. I grew up believing that vulnerability is weak, to be avoided, scary, undesirable, risky, raw, insecure. And I can see from the chat page that a lot of you are feeling very similar to those comments we've received in the past. Many people think that vulnerability and weakness are synonymous. Being vulnerable is the risk we need to take to experience real connection. Feeling vulnerable is when the risk of getting rejected, laughed at, or criticized is real. While we often celebrate it as a strength in other people, we tend to see it as a weakness in ourselves. We love seeing raw truth and openness in other people, but we are afraid to let them see it in us. Vulnerability is courage in you and inadequacy in me. We struggle tremendously with vulnerability. We love other people's vulnerability, their stories of strength and courage in facing down adversity. But when engaging our own vulnerability, we feel a combination of terror and insecurity. The good news is that I think people are tired of the hustle. They're tired of doing it, and they're tired of watching it. We're hungry for people who have the courage to say, I need help, or I own that mistake, or I'm not willing to define success simply by my title or my income any longer. We crave real connection. So here's the thing. People connect more with those who have weaknesses. It's what makes people more relatable. Most of us don't trust perfect, and that's a good instinct. In the research, there's a significant difference between perfectionism and healthy striving, or striving for excellence. Perfectionism is the belief that if we do things perfectly and we look perfect, we can minimize or avoid the pain of blame, judgment, and shame. Perfectionism is a 20-ton shield, armor that we lug around thinking it will protect us, when in fact, it's the thing that's really preventing us from being seen. Perfectionism is also very different than self-improvement. And we know a lot of you work hard on self-improvement. Perfectionism is at its core about trying to earn approval. Most perfectionists grew up being praised for achievement and performance. Somewhere along the way, they adopted this dangerous and debilitating belief system. I am what I accomplish and how well I accomplish it. Please perform, perfect. Healthy striving is self-focused. How can I improve? Perfectionism, on the other hand, is other-focused. What will they think? Perfectionism is a hustle. Perfectionism is not a way to avoid shame. Perfectionism is a form of shame. Where we struggle with perfectionism, we struggle with shame. And Kathy's going to talk in a few minutes about shame. So next, we'd like to cover a couple of myths that are pretty typical in regard to vulnerability. And the first myth we kind of touched on already, and it's that vulnerability is a weakness. Vulnerability is the emotion that we experience during times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Think for a moment about a single example of courage that you've witnessed in another or experienced in your own life that did not require experiencing vulnerability. Not a single act of courage can be exercised without the companion of vulnerability. Here's the thing, guys. Vulnerability is not a weakness. In fact, it's our greatest measure of courage. So here's the second myth. It's, I don't do vulnerability. Well, here's the thing. There's no opting out, but there are two options. You can do vulnerability, or it can do you. Pretending that we don't do it means letting fear drive our thinking and our behavior without our input or even our awareness, which almost always leads to acting out or shutting down. There's no opting out. You can do vulnerability or it can do you. There's another Brené Brown quote that I love. Vulnerability isn't just the center of hard emotions, it's the core of all emotions and all meaningful human experiences. To feel is to be vulnerable. Believing that vulnerability is a weakness is believing that feeling is a weakness, which is part of the problem, because in our American society in particular, feelings are typically viewed as something unproductive and even dumb. We're conditioned to ignore them and push them aside, both of which are not only impossible to sustain, but also an unhealthy way to live. Vulnerability is the key to resilient leadership. Resilient leaders that engage in the practice of vulnerability allow their whole, authentic selves to shine forth. They allow their thoughts and feelings to be congruent with the self they project to the world. Part of being authentic is admitting you're not perfect and you don't have all the answers. If leaders show they're vulnerable, people are willing to follow them. It brings people in. It's an invitation to be human, and it's giving permission to others to also be vulnerable and human.
What makes embracing vulnerability feel the most terrifying is how taking off the armor and exposing our hearts can open us up to experiencing shame. Shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we're flawed and therefore unworthy of love, belonging, and connection. Something we've experienced, done, or failed to do makes us unworthy of connection. We all have it, right, Trace?
I certainly do. And I haven't met somebody yet that doesn't have shame.
Oh, me either. We're all afraid to talk about it, but the thing is, the less we talk about it, the more control it has over our lives. Vulnerability is uncomfortable, but Brene Brown has discovered something hidden behind it. It's something that as a society we keep under wraps. In fact, it's so hidden that we don't even realize it's the cause of our broken relationships. In Brown's study of vulnerability, she uncovered the hidden gremlin no one wants to admit or talk about: shame. Shame drives two tapes: never good enough, who do you think you are? And who doesn't relate to this secret screaming loudly inside, huh?
I know I do. I hear those words in my self talk.
Yep, me too. Shame isn't guilt. Shame is a focus on self, and guilt is a focus on behavior. Shame is, I am bad, and guilt is, I did something bad. So here's an apology example of guilt versus shame. Guilt says, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. And shame says, I'm sorry, I am a mistake. Here's another quote from Brene that we like. Life is about daring greatly. When a speaker is about to walk onto the stage and thinks, I'm going in and I'm going to try this, shame is the gremlin who says, you're not good enough. You never finished that MBA. Your wife left you. I know your dad really wasn't in Luxembourg. He was in Sing Sing. I know those things that happened to you growing up. I know you don't think you're pretty, smart, talented, or powerful enough. I know your dad never paid attention even when you made CFO. Shame is that thing. Shame bias is the belief that if you tell your overcoming story, I will think more of you. But if I tell my story, you will think less of me. I'm going to share with you a shame bias about myself. So I'm getting vulnerable here. I never went to college and always thought that I wouldn't be able to get a job that paid me as much money as those who were college graduates. That belief was confirmed by some other people in my life who thought I'd only be able to reach a certain level of income because of it. That shame stopped me from asking for raises when I truly deserved them. But on the flip side, I've always been in awe of other people who have successful careers despite not having gone on for further education. I find them to be inspiring. Isn't it interesting then that we don't allow ourselves the same awe-inspiring accolades that we give to others with the same story? Shame bias stands between our noble efforts to share our truest selves with the world and the paralyzing fear that when we do, the world won't accept us.
Very true.
Where shame exists, empathy is almost always absent. That's what makes shame so dangerous. The opposite of experiencing shame is experiencing empathy. Many people today are empathy-less, not shameless. Shame is highly correlated with addiction and violence, aggression, depression, eating disorders, and bullying. The more shame there is about these behaviors, the greater their hold on a person. Guilt is inversely correlated with these behaviors. If we can hold something we've done or failed to do up against who we want to be and see it as a mistake, it's uncomfortable, but it's adaptive. There can be reconciliation and resolution is possible. Shame, on the other hand, is an epidemic in our society, and we need to understand how it affects us and how it affects the way we're parenting, the way we're working, and the way we're looking at each other. So if we're going to find our way back to each other, vulnerability is going to be that path.
So here's yet another Brene statement. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. Without vulnerability, there is no creativity and innovation. Why? Because there's nothing more uncertain than the creative process. And there's absolutely no innovation without failure. So I love this one, you guys. This is coming from Brene Brown again. Can you tell how much we love her? Live tweeting your bikini wax is not vulnerability, nor is posting a blow-by-blow of your divorce. That's an attempt to hotwire connection. It's built up slowly. It's about trust and time. We need trust to be vulnerable, and we need to be vulnerable in order to build trust. They go hand in hand, back and forth. Being vulnerable builds trust, and trust is earned not through heroic deeds or even highly visible actions, but through paying attention, listening, deep listening, empathy, and gestures of genuine care and connection.
So, given all that we've just laid out for you, let's go over some key steps for creating the space for authentic connections. And the first is to be radically self-aware. The ability to look inward and be honest with what we're feeling and what's driving our actions, decisions, and words. We know that when a leader is given the tools to become radically self-aware of how fear is impacting their ability to lead successfully, they've taken the first step in turning the ship. Self-awareness is the foundational tool of all great leaders. It's the ability to look inward and be honest with what we're feeling and what's driving our actions, decisions, and words. Bringing our inner mindset into our awareness is the first step in helping to reduce its potential unhelpful impacts. we first have to see it, name it, and then commit to moving beyond it. And one way to become radically self-aware is by having a temperament analysis profile done. Tracy and I are certified temperament analysts and have analyzed and consulted with individuals and couples and worked with them on identifying the strengths of their temperaments and how to build upon them and identifying strategies for maneuvering through the struggles. Another step is true belonging. True belonging only happens when we present our authentic, imperfect selves to the world. So now this next statement is very powerful. Our sense of belonging can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance. I'm going to say that again. Our sense of belonging can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance. Don't walk through the world looking for evidence that you don't belong, because the truth is, you'll always find it. So here are a few recommendations of practices that we use to cultivate self-compassion, self-love, and self-acceptance, and thereby true belonging. Watch what you say after the words, I am. It's a very powerful statement of who we believe that we are. So if I say, I'm not good at public speaking, or I'm not good at meeting and making conversation with people, then I will believe it. Instead, say, I'm getting better and better every day at speaking in front of people or connecting with others. Can you see what a difference that makes?
I love this, Kathy. It's so important to work on our own self-talk and our own belief system about ourself.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The other thing is saying affirmations. You can make up a whole list of them and post them all over if you like, but make sure that you change them up frequently because we tend to look past them after a while. Affirmations like, I am enough, and I bring creative solutions wherever I go.
Those are my two favorites.
Yeah, me too. There's also mirror work, looking in the mirror, saying, I love you. I really love you. I love myself as God loves me.
So you guys, that might feel a little odd at first, but I really encourage you and invite you to try it. It's powerful, and if you do it every day, even several times a day, it will start to feel very genuine and almost bring you to tears. Where at first it may feel awkward, or you may look at yourself and see your wrinkles or your bags under your eyes and all of the flaws and imperfections.
No, I don't have them.
That'll
No.
quickly melt away if
You're
you
putting that in my head, Trace. I don't want those wrinkles in. No. Okay.
You don't have any of those, I don't have any of those.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I love saying, things like, you go, girl, you got this. Yeah. Pump yourself up. Yeah. Okay. So then also another one is not allowing yourself to ruminate. Oh my goodness. This is a huge one for me because I tend to look back on the past and be thinking of, how I could do things differently. Okay. It's good to go back there once, right? Figure out how you could have done it differently, but then, hey, you're done, right? No need to go back there again. Also having practices in place for gratitude and savoring the good. So we rewire our brain to look for more of that instead of all the negative.
That's been, I would say, one of the most powerful practices that I've implemented in my life. I talked to a lot of you about gratitude practice.
Yeah, I do think I agree with you, Trace. It's probably the most powerful tool that I've used in my life as well.
Yeah.
And then the last one is a forgiveness practice that involves forgiving ourselves and others. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next step, which is being you. Being you is massively different from being perfect. Being the best possible version of yourself. We're all human, and by definition, that means that we're often messy and raw, and we do things imperfectly. When we love only the parts of ourselves that we deem to be good or strong or smart, unfortunately, we reject the parts that make us real. This sets us up for inauthenticity. We start hiding what is real and showing off what is sparkly. But our seeming perfection is fake. The only thing to do with all our imperfections is to accept them with forgiveness and compassion, and to accept how we feel about our flaws, which is probably not so good. This doesn't mean that we're resigned to never growing or overcoming our weaknesses. It just means that we can be our true selves on this path. Another way is to actually celebrate our imperfections. Ask for help and be open about when you make a mistake or miss the mark. It'll allow others to see that it's okay to fail at times too. Being perfect is impossible, guys, and trying to be perfect can be a massive drain on both your time and energy. We're all human beings with many great strengths and many areas that we struggle with. The more we try to tightly control our vision of perfection, the more constrained we feel inside, which is a catalyst for stress. Let go and allow yourself to celebrate your imperfections.
So another step to creating authentic connections is to lead by example. If you don't model leading with vulnerability, it's highly unlikely that anyone else will. Your ability to see, name, and voice your own vulnerability at the right time will give others the courage and the permission to do the same thing. And Kathy and I are just so pleased with this entire group and how vulnerable you have been willing to be in our sessions. So I have no doubt that you're going to, if you're not already, use that vulnerability and lead by example.
Yeah.
Leading with vulnerability is not about being reckless with your emotions or falling apart as a leader. It's about being aware of our inner worlds, feeling it, recognizing it, and sharing it appropriately. This is true courage. And that is exactly what your team, your organization, and others need from you. Remember, courage is contagious. So another way to cultivate authentic connections is to reward others when they too lead with vulnerability. If people don't feel like they will be rewarded for being vulnerable, they may not find the courage to make that first step. Reward people by acknowledging and even praising their courage when you see it, so that others can witness it. This will breed more and more courage to open up to being vulnerable. As Brene once again states, authenticity is a collection of choices that we have to make every day. It's about the choice to show up and be real, the choice to be honest, the choice to let our true selves be seen. Most of us are trying to live an authentic life. Deep down, we want to take off our game face and be real and imperfect. It's about allowing our thoughts and our feelings to be congruent with the self that we project to the world. And by authentic, we mean the kind of connection that doesn't require hustling for acceptance and changing who we are to fit in. So every morning, set the intention to be authentic and keep your armor off. Kathy and I talk a lot about intentionality and choices. And we intentionally need to recommit to ourselves, sometimes every moment of every day, that we have an opportunity to make a choice. And we can choose to leave our armor off, to be vulnerable, and to make authentic connections.
I love that, Trace. I love starting every morning by making that intention of being authentic during your day.
Yeah, and it requires that level of commitment because we can be taken off path pretty easy, can't we? Whenever, hurdles come along the way, it's important that we continue to remind ourselves that it's a choice and that we desire to be intentional with our life. And so it's recommitting to that every day and many times throughout the day.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to clarify what we mean by taking our armor off, because this does not mean that we have no filter, that we express every thought that we have, or that we allow ourselves to be reactionary. This would lack self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and authenticity. It means allowing yourself to be seen and heard. It's about being brave and courageous. It's about exercising empathy and curiosity. And in order to do this, we have to get vulnerable.
Yeah.
So we've talked about Brene Brown a whole lot here this morning, and we've referred to her work. We love her, and we highly recommend, in particular, 2 of her books, Daring Greatly and Dare to Lead. They really have provided us with a lot of the content for today's presentation. She also has 2 extremely powerful TED Talks that, if you haven't watched them, they're wonderful. One's The Power of Vulnerability, and the other is titled Listening to Shame.
So let's talk a little bit about cultivating your authentic story. You're the main character in the story of your life. What stories are you co-creating? What stories are you carrying around in your head about who you are and how you fit in the world? Every moment of every day, we're creating stories in our head based on our perception, our assumptions about what we're experiencing. All of us, all day, every day, are doing this. And we're even building upon past stories about ourselves and each other, many of which are not even accurate. I'm going to tell you a story told by Brene Brown as an example of how telling yourself an inaccurate story can play out. One summer, she and her husband, Steve, took a long-awaited vacation with the kids at a lake in the hill country of Texas. The two of them go for a swim in the lake and feel taken with the deep joy of the moment. Brene says something very sweet and very vulnerable to her spouse. "I'm so glad we decided to do this together," she says. "It's beautiful out here." Her husband, she shares, is way better than her at putting himself out there, so she expected him to reply to her romantic bid with an equal force of affection. But instead, "Yeah, water's good," he replied. She felt embarrassed, ashamed, and going against her conflict-oriented upbringing, she decided to make another bid for connection. "This is so great," she said. "I love that we're doing this. I feel so close to you." Again, deaf ears. "Yep, good swim," he replied before swimming away. Brene was nonplussed. "This is total horseshit," she remembers thinking. "What's going on? I don't know if I'm supposed to feel humiliated or hostile." Before they got out, she asked him to stop, saying that she kept trying to connect with him and he kept blowing her off. Then, instead of being aggressive and self-protective, she opted for being kind. And she relied on a certain life hack she learned in her research. "I feel like you're blowing me off," she said. "And the is either you looked at me while I was swimming and thought, 'Man, she's getting old. She can't even swim freestyle anymore.' Or you saw me and thought, 'She sure as hell doesn't rock a Speedo like she did 25 years ago.'"
Kathy, for me, you cut out on kind of the key line. I don't know if you did for everyone, but would you go over her response again? "I feel like
Okay,
you're blowing me off."
sure. "I feel like you're blowing me off," she said. "And the story I'm making up is either you looked at me while I was swimming and thought, 'Man, she's getting old. She can't even swim freestyle anymore.' Or you saw me and thought, 'She sure as hell doesn't rock a Speedo like she did 25 years ago.'" After a little time, Steve replied. He wasn't being distant to spite her. He said that he'd been trying to fight off a panic attack the whole swim. He explained that the night before he had a dream where he was with their kids on a raft when a speedboat came screaming toward them, and he had to pull all the children into the water so they wouldn't get killed by the raging vessel. He didn't even know what his wife was saying to him while they swam. He was just trying to concentrate on his swimming and make it back to the dock. Suddenly, it made sense to her. People on the lake do tend to get drunk on boats, and everybody who grows up around water hears about tragic boating accidents. And he felt that she would think less of him for not being able to prevent one. After a little more conversation, it became clear to both of them. Brene was stuck in a shame story that she wasn't fit or pretty enough for Steve. And Steve was stuck in a shame story that he wasn't strong or capable enough for Brene. I can certainly see where a similar scenario has played out many times in my life. How about you, Tracy?
Most definitely. It's amazing how quickly things can spin out of control and we can be triggered. And I've had many circumstances like that in my own life. So guys, we are bumping up against our hour time frame. We just have 2 more final slides to go over. We understand if you need to sign off, but we are going to probably go about 5 minutes over, okay? So anybody who's been in or out of any type of relationship can tell you that they're full of miscommunications, misreadings, and other misunderstandings. You say one thing, they hear something else. Better yet, you project motivations onto them, drawing out conclusions about their behavior that they can't even understand. A simple strategy that can help create authentic connections, authentic relationships and stories, and allow us to better understand is using the phrase to yourself and to another person that goes like this: the story I'm making up is. It can be extremely powerful.
Yeah.
Basically, you're telling the other person your reading of the situation and simultaneously admitting that you know it can't be 100% correct. It's a lifesaver. It's honest. It's transparent. And yes, it's vulnerable. Vulnerability essentially provides the bandwidth for 2 people to relate and trust one another. When you say, the story I'm making up is, it conveys, I want you to see me and understand me and hear me. And knowing what you really mean is more important to me than being right or self-protecting. With those 6 words, you check the narrative in your head and you can create a more authentic story.
Yeah.
So we would like to end with, yes, yet another Brené Brown quote. And it goes like this: so all the things that we think are so important, the accolades, applause, the number of likes, followers, bikini pics, or wearing the right watch, none of that matters. I believe only 2 things matter on the last hour of our last day. Number 1, who did you become? Were you good? Were you authentic? Did you walk toward your fears, and as messy and bloody as it was, walk through them so you wear your scar tissue with pride? Number 2, how many people did you serve? I believe that to lead is to serve. I believe the highest form of a human being is doing your work and living in a way that helps other people believe in themselves. And that makes the world a better place. Kathy and I are grateful that you chose to spend part of your Saturday with us. We're honored that you chose to join us. We are passionate about helping each other to live our best lives and to create authentic connections and stories. And as always, thank you, Brandon and Amanda, for creating the opportunity for this presentation and the sharing. So at this point, we'll entertain any questions that you might have through the chat feature. Our website is up on the screen. We welcome the opportunity to help you become radically self-aware and to cultivate authenticity for yourself and your relationships. You are very welcome, you guys. We'll sit tight here for just a moment to see if there are any questions that come up. How do you feel are some healthy ways to lead with resilience on social media? I need to put my glasses on here. So I'll read it again. How do you feel are some healthy ways to lead with resilience on social media. So resilience is really that ability to bounce back, to come back when something hasn't gone the way that you'd hoped it would. Um, and, you know, first of all, my recommendation on social media is to be authentic, to be vulnerable, just like you would be in person, to exercise lots of empathy. And, you know, that's also a whole nother presentation, but really deep listening with curiosity is, you know, some key criteria for practicing empathy. So as best as you can, do the same thing you would in person. And I've been sharing with a lot of people in regard to resilience is that just show up, consistently show up and do the right thing and not worry so much about the results, especially anytime that you're engaging in new behavior. Just show up, be consistent. You know, if you fail, you fail. You bounce back, you get yourself back up and you do it again, would be my recommendation. Kathy, I'm sure you've got some thoughts on that as well.
Actually, Trace, I think you answered that perfectly. I
Okay.
really don't have anything else to add. But,
Okay.
you know, mostly what we're finding is that very few people actually listen to what other people are saying. And listening is a vulnerable position to come from as well. We're not talking about ourselves, we're listening and we're allowing another person to share with us. And only then can we discover how we can help this person in their lives, right?
Okay, so a few other questions here.
Yeah.
But
By the way, Trace, someone had asked if we're recording this and if we'll be posted on our website. We are recording it. We will try and make that happen.
Okay, I'm trying to quickly jot down questions as they're scrolling here. Okay, so a few more. One of them was, what happens when we live out our true self and being vulnerable and the environment is overall toxic?
Yeah.
That's a good one. We all experience many scenarios of this. I know, Kathy, you and I have talked about this a lot. Do you want to share some thoughts on that?
About being vulnerable in a toxic environment?
Yes.
Yeah. So, you know, we're not in control over what other people do in our lives or in the world. All that we can possibly do is control what we do ourselves, develop routines and habits, strengthen who we are as an individual, become vulnerable ourselves, and lead by example. Leading by example is the most important thing that we can do in our lives. It shows others a different way to live. And that ripple is going to affect a lot of people. Is it going to affect everyone? No. Some people are really entrenched in the way that they live. But yes, we are going to create ripples and we're going to affect many people's lives. And that will slowly, as more and more people do that, change the environment that we live in to one of being filled with love, and I'm going to say light, and helping, serving people, tenderness, and our heart-centered connections with people. What would you add to that, Trace?
No, I think you did a great job, Kathy. We can only control ourselves and our reactions. We can't control anyone else's. So it's what we bring to the table. And I do believe in the power of sending out ripples, of leading by example and putting out there good energy. I've seen the impact of that. It doesn't always clear out all the toxicity, certainly, but it goes a long way towards helping to make situations more manageable.
Yeah.
And really just focusing yourself on what you can do and not worrying about as much what other people's choices are.
Yeah. And actually, this also answers another question. How do you help a loved one overcome his fear of
Yeah.
becoming vulnerable? And the truth is, we, you know, showing somebody by example is the best way to do that,
Yeah.
because we can't control what that person does, even though they're our loved ones and we want to. The truth is we can't, but we can speak with them, and more importantly than that, show them by example how to live their life a different way.
Yeah, I would add to that something that I know both Kathy and I practice, and that's holding space without judgment. So people feel safe to be vulnerable when they feel like they're going to still be accepted and not judged. So we both have worked really hard at trying to eliminate judgment. When people sense that they can come to you and you're not going to judge them, and you're not going to try to give them all the answers, lecture them, preach them, give them advice. You're simply holding the space for them to be heard, to be seen, to make their own decisions. Most people, when they start to voice to you their vulnerability, if it's a challenge, for instance, they're having, just the process of them speaking, it will help them themselves to understand what they need to do. They don't really need for us to jump in and give advice. So I'm not saying that that's this situation, but a lot of times people are fearful of being vulnerable because they sense they might be judged when they are, and they might not be accepted. And so really working on that judgment piece has helped people to feel safe and open up more.
Yeah.
We skipped one on apologizing, and this one really resonates with me. Oh my gosh, let me see. I myself have felt the need to apologize for being myself when I feel people don't fully understand my words or actions. Are there any healthy ways to correct that response in myself, or to respond when others do the same? So I used to apologize all the time. And where mine came from was, I think, really wanting to feel validated by others, accepted by others. So I would just apologize a lot for being imperfect, really. And so it really came with a lot of self-work, self-awareness work on where that was coming from, and not needing that validation to come from others anymore. I don't know if that answers your question. Kathy, do you have thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I feel the same. I mean, there are obviously times when we need to apologize for something that we, hurt someone's feelings, or did something wrong. But uh, other than that, we we can't apologize for who we are as a person. Um, this is all about embracing your imperfections and going out into the world and being the best part of yourself, and you know not feeling like you have to be perfect or to apologize in order to be understood, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have one here about supines in particular, but it's with the statistics of 40% less empathetic than 30 years ago. Is this why we get drained? How can we avoid getting too drained and can re-energize? So I'd say the answer to that is yes. It's very much a component to why we feel so drained. When we're losing the ability to empathize with each other, to really feel seen and heard, then we have that sense of disconnection, which causes us to feel drained. And, then we armor up more and we're carrying around that 20-ton shield all the time, which is in and of itself very draining. So, really, again, here, all we can really do is lead by example with others, talk about it with others as an important characteristic. It's hard to change the whole rest of the world to be more empathizing with each other, but it's definitely, I feel, having a big impact on the quality of our relationships. Empathy truly is the oil, the key to keeping relationships running smoothly. And so when we don't have that, we feel disconnected, we are struggling, relationships are struggling. That is truly draining. Kathy,
Well,
what would you add?
yeah. Isn't it interesting, Tracy, too, that when we are our authentic selves out in the world, we feel less drained because we're not trying to be something that we're not. So it's re-energizing to be who you authentically are, and to take your armor off and to be vulnerable. It's freeing, it's energizing. We're not putting forth all that effort to cover ourselves up.
Yeah, I think another thing potentially comes into play here, and that's that I think a lot of people are walking around the world as what we call empaths, people who can really, truly take on and absorb the challenges that other people were around are feeling and their energy. And that's a whole nother issue. If you're really feeling that being out in the world and other people and environments you're in are draining you, that we can certainly talk about as a potential cause and how to re-energize from that.
Mhm.
Okay, so we have, what story might I be telling myself when I care too much about what others think?
Hmm.
You want to tackle that?
We sure have grown up with that, haven't we?
We sure have.
Yeah. So yeah, this is a tough one because we've struggled with this our lives, all of our lives. And I kind of liken it to trying to be perfect as well.
Yeah.
Caring so much about what other people think that we strive for perfection, and that's very draining. So what's really interesting and what I ask myself is, what do I think about myself? Isn't that more important to me than what other people think? Because if I think well of myself and I know that I'm being authentically who I am and spreading ripples out into the world, why should it matter what someone else's think and someone else thinks? And the reality is that the people who I care about what they think will see that in me. We can't control what other people are thinking. And the truth is, what they think is going to be more a reflection of them than it is a reflection of me. So to move about in the world and just be happy with the way that you are being, the way that you are moving about in the world, the way that you are interacting with people, and the way that you are being the best version of yourself.
Yeah, Kathy mentioned a line in the presentation. Your true belonging can only be as great as your self-acceptance.
Yeah.
So it's really working on our accepting of ourself. And I say that very honestly because I think that that's something very common amongst all of us, is needing to really work on, first and foremost, accepting ourselves, with
Yeah.
all of the imperfectly perfect things that we bring to the table. We are created perfectly imperfect. and, really allowing ourselves to shine in the areas that are our, God-given strengths, and then working to kind of shore up the areas that are more struggles for us and be the best version of ourselves, and being accepting of that version of ourselves. Yeah. Okay. So here's one that kind of is similar to the toxic environment one. How do you protect your vulnerability when it's abused by someone you love, or you become hurt from being vulnerable to someone who doesn't see the value in your vulnerability?
Oh boy. Okay.
We've all been there. We've all, I think, well, I'm guessing that most of us have been in that situation and experienced moments where we have been vulnerable, and that vulnerability has been used in a way that's unhealthy, and been taken advantage of, in essence. And it's hard. It's a hurtful thing. But standing firm in what your choices are in life, and in your choice to be intentional and be vulnerable, is important. But creating boundaries is also an acceptable thing. That's where we need to be smart about our choices with certain individuals in our lives. And I think healthy boundaries is an important concept for all of us to keep in mind as it relates to all of our choices, including to be vulnerable. Kathy, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. Boundaries is really important. It's especially difficult with our loved ones because they're in our lives. They can be family. They can be people we dearly love. But the truth is, we can't control what other people say and do and think. But we can create boundaries for ourselves to be our healthiest, and we can sometimes limit the time that we spend with people who don't value who we truly are.
More on apologizing. Katrina, I used to do that too. I used to say, I'm sorry for saying I'm sorry. Boy, it was a conundrum. Trying to scan here, and you guys, Kathy and I do have a Mother's Day event to get to for our mom. So
we have a Mother's Day parade.
Yes.
In front of her senior facility. Yeah.
So we'll take a few more questions if there are any as I'm scrolling here. We so appreciate your engagement. We so appreciate your comments. Thank you, thank you, thank you for that.
Yeah. Yes, you are also uplifting and welcoming. Thank you so much.
I think
Yep.
that's hitting all of the questions. If there's one we missed, please post it again, and we'll certainly answer it here. We have just a few more minutes. But you guys are you're so fabulous to work with. We so appreciate working with you guys. And for the mothers that are out there, we wish you a happy Mother's Day.
Yes, happy Mother's Day.
And thank you again for taking time out of your Saturday to listen about the fun topics of vulnerability and shame and armoring up and perfectionism and authentic connections. Feel free to reach out to us if you do have any other questions or things that we can help clarify for you. We're available to you for meeting those needs. And yeah, we'll see about maybe, I don't know how to handle that recording. If you want a recording of today, maybe reach out to us with that request as well. and we'll see about, I've never sent one out before, so I've had them for my own purpose. I've never sent them out. I'm sure that's something that we can work on doing. So,
Yeah.
All right, everyone.
All right. Have a great Saturday, a great weekend.
Yes, and okay, I hate to end the chat here, but I will. I'm going to do that for all of us. Okay.
Bye, everyone. Okay.
Okay, I had to stop sharing in order to end. Okay, Kath, I'm ending it.
All right. I'm taking off as soon as I can. Okay.
Okay, sounds good. See you in a few.
All right. See you in a few.